I think we've given people an extra 2 minutes, so let's jump in if you're good, if you're ready, Sonja. Yeah,
Sure, go for it.
Okay. Well, hi everybody. This is in some ways an exceptional seminar. We wanted Sonja to speak for some time, but this is the timing that works. So I'm very glad that you're joining us today. Hadi is going to introduce Sonja, who is a former resident, you could say, of IRES, now that residence really matters. But before starting, I'd just like to acknowledge that UBC's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We are, as Gordon mentioned last week, uninvited guests. I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and so to also acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. So welcome, Sonja. I'll turn things over to Hadi to introduce you, and looking forward to your talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. I find it very interesting to contrast the language of uninvited guests with invasion. House invasions, etc., would be more likely, but that's okay. So Sonja, when or if you have become a professor, so you'll come across students who start teaching you from day one and continue to teach you after they've completed their degrees and go on to fantastic careers. One second, I've got to get my dog onto the balcony. But Sonja is such a person from whom I've learned truly from the very first day, from projects that were related to her thesis to projects that were not related to her thesis. She's always been someone who brings wisdom, a different perspective, and the ability to see the equity and justice sides of questions wherever they may lie. And I look very much forward to hearing this talk. And now go and deal with the dog.
Thanks, Hadi. I hope your dog is okay. Hi, everyone. It's really, really nice to be here. I'm going to quickly share my screen here so we can get going. I'm also not always the best timekeeper, so Terry, if you or someone want to flag me down when I'm getting close to time.
Sure, I can give you a 5-minute warning. That's fine.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you so much. So I want to, I'm so pleased to be here. And when I was first thinking about what exactly I wanted to talk about, I had a couple of different research talks I thought about. And then I was like, you know what? No, I want to do something different. I want to use this opportunity to give a talk I've never given before, actually, but that spurred about sort of thinking about what have I learned since I left IRES about climate change and justice. So for those of you who don't know me, I started working on climate change and justice while I was at IRES in my doctoral program. And it actually came about in a slightly backwards kind of way. I had not gone there to work on this topic. And I was being encouraged to work on a topic, a different topic that I felt pretty uncomfortable about. It was looking at some adaptation projects in some very wealthy communities. And I was thinking quite seriously of quitting. And I had a conversation with Hadi, and he said, it sounds to me like you are really thinking about justice and climate change. So why don't you do a dissertation on that? And I said, well, can you even do that? Like, that doesn't sound possible. And I now understand that only a physicist would have answered me in quite this way. Of course it's possible. I don't know anything about justice, but you'll figure it out. And so here I am. And I've been working on justice and climate change ever since. And the theme that I want to pull out today is this issue of relationships, which is not one that was part of how I was initially thinking of this issue, and which has come to be, for me, probably the most central and important part of climate injustice issues, especially as we as scholars try to figure out where we fit in this. How are we useful? Why are we doing what we're doing? And so what? What's the big so what to any of the work that we're doing? So that's going to be the theme of today. And I want to start with my own land acknowledgement. I am sitting here on what would be Anishinaabe territory. And I really like this map because it, of course, is not the orientation that I was initially taught how to identify where I'm from. I'm here with this little pink dot on what we now know as the southern shore of Georgian Bay. And the reason I like this particular way, this is, of course, an Anishinaabe map in which the east is up, of orienting myself here is that relationships in climate injustice is all about who am I, where am I, and why am I doing what I'm doing in the place that I am. And I think that using our relationships to land, territory, opens up all kinds of interesting and often very uncomfortable questions. Like, well, why? What's the history by which this orientation of the map was new to me? Why is it that I didn't learn my place in this orientation? And what does that do for my work moving on? So one of the things that I've enjoyed about engaging with a lot of the Indigenous scholarship on climate justice, but also more broadly, has been a focus on relationship. And it has forced me to rethink how I think about relationships in this space. So when I started working on climate change and justice, this was in the early 2000s, I thought, incorrectly, it turns out, that there wasn't that much written on this. But of course there was, I just didn't know the way to find it. A lot of the most exciting work was happening in the Global South. A lot of it was happening in the gray literature. I didn't know it, but already years before I had started to work on this, a group of activists in South Africa had already been using climate change justice language way before any of the NGOs and way before the academic community was. But this was inaccessible to me. That being said, I initially started to focus on these three key issues, which are still at the heart of any kind of discussion of climate and justice. One is the fact these are just profoundly different historical trajectories and responsibilities for the problems. We have hugely uneven climate impacts, massive differences in how benefits have accumulated to whom and how through these processes. And this is where I started. And this is where the literature was, and these all seemed and continue to seem like very reasonable elements of any kind of discussion of climate injustice. But of course, what you quickly learn when you start to really engage with different scholars, different communities, is that it's more complicated and more pernicious than this. So not only do we have vastly uneven historical accumulations of both responsibility and benefits, not only do we have vastly uneven experiences of climate impacts, but these are integrated with each other, and they're tied to these systems that shape durable inequality. And this would, of course, you can't really talk about many of these things without quickly getting into issues of systemic racism, colonialism, and how segregation works in our minds and in our spaces. And all of this takes place across time and across scales. So you have this very dynamic space where to really pick apart climate change and justice, you have to think about how these different aspects are not only happening, but how they're happening in relationship to each other. And of course, this is all a big political mess at any scale, whether you're talking about a city, a region, internationally. When I first started working on climate change and justice, a number of people, actually mostly political scientists, but we won't hold that against them, said, you shouldn't work on climate change and justice. It's impossible. It's just going to make it worse. This is too political. And I would argue that, in fact, it's because it's political that we need to work on this. Actors will and have used arguments of justice in so many ways in this space. So for instance, if you want to take a good look at this in action, you need only read Donald Trump's statement from the Rose Garden when withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, in which he uses the word fair 8 times. And so we can think about how arguments for justice get built into political disputes. But underneath all of that, I want to focus on relationships, because I think that they're actually the heart of how we think about justice. And to root us in that, I want to start with a little story. This happened in 2011. I was in Durban for the international climate negotiations. I was an observer to the UN system for quite a long time. I actually started when I was at UBC in 2009, was the first year I went to the international negotiations. And I was staying at the KwaZulu-Natal University, where most of the members of PACJA, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, were also staying. And one of the elements of staying there meant you had to wait for these fairly erratic little buses to transport you to the main space. And so we were waiting, as we spent a lot of time waiting, because no one was really entirely sure. You had to have some more insider knowledge than I was ever going to be able to have to understand the schedule of these buses. And we started to chat. And we were talking about climate change and why this woman was here. And she was the leader of a food security or NGO from Nigeria. And as we got on this bus, she sort of turned to me and said, we're already facing the impacts of climate change. This isn't tomorrow, it's today. How can they not see what they are doing to us? We must have faith that eventually they will see us. And this has stuck with me for so many reasons, partly because in this conversation, I was the they. As a representative of the global north, I am the epitome of the they in this conversation. There's also this faith of hers that they will see us. And so this question of recognition. What does it mean to be truly seen? And in this, I'd like to pull on Bell Hooks, who I've learned a lot from when I'm teaching my students classes on justice. We always go back to her writings on love and justice. And that in fact, justice is that, for me, that sense for each of us can think about, what does it feel like to be seen by the person who loves us fullest and most honestly? That sense of freedom, of being fully recognized in all of your complexity. That is a sense of what it means to be loved. And in a just world, we would be able to do this. As Cornel West says, justice is love in public. And so this issue of what does it really mean to see is at the heart of a relationship. What kind of a relationship allows someone or does not allow someone to be seen or to see another in their fullest sense? This was brought home to me even more clearly recently when I was working with as an advisory capacity to a large NGO, which was trying to put together a multiracial approach to climate reparations. I worked on climate reparations off and on, and myself and one of my colleagues, who's an international lawyer who works on this, were advising, and it was a really challenging situation. We had a lot of community groups in the United States for whom reparations, for those of you who are not familiar with the conversation of reparations in the United States, reparations for slavery for African Americans is central to this conversation. And from an American context, the real focus is a race-based conversation of repair starting at the point of slavery. And in this context, climate change overlays on that and that claim. In an international conversation, climate reparations have a very different perspective, which is the exploitative relationship between the United States and other countries, largely the global South. And from this perspective, thinking about the differences within the United States is somewhat jarring. So activists would be like, wait, you want us to pay reparations to people inside the United States? How does this make any sense? And so we were having to find ways of having conversations which allowed groups to think through what the lines were that were similar in why and how particular groups were facing harms and particular groups were reaping benefits. And one of the things that I started to realize here was the role of segregation and the role in which separating those who are experiencing harms from those who are experiencing benefits is at the heart of what has mechanistically allowed these systems of deep injustice to develop. And so here, climate change isn't only characterized by injustice, but it's a symptom of injustice. It's in fact our inability to tackle fundamental structural inequality and the way in which this leads to all kinds of forms of segregation, such that those who are elites have almost no real connection with those who are facing harms, allows the entire system to become vulnerable because we can no longer see systemic threats. Instead, those facing threats are seen as uniquely vulnerable, rather than the entire system having been eroded by a system of profound, unchangeable, persistent inequality and injustice. So from this take, relationships aren't simply an overlay. It's saying, actually, this is about relationships. This is about what allows relationships to be exploitative and how do you shift them. So then once I started thinking about relationships, I started thinking, well, what does, if I'm a researcher and I'm moving into the area of climate justice, what have I learned about relationships and how might I use this? How do I use this to shape my scholarship, and how might others use this in productive ways? And so I've kind of, in a very ad hoc way, kind of reflected on what I've learned from a lot of years of trying to do this. And I've kind of more or less loosely distilled a couple of insights I think are helpful. One is this idea that relationships help us pay attention to historical patterns, which I think are central to any conversation about climate and injustice. I think if we take them seriously, they allow us to think about the diversity of issues that actually shape what communities are looking at in terms of option sets. I think they help us engage more seriously with the social psychological challenges inherent to injustice. And most usefully as a scholar, I think they highlight this notion of solidarity. And so I'm going to go through each of these really briefly. Again, this is a deeply unscientific approach at reflecting on some of the things I've learned. And so anything and everything here is open to contestation and questioning. And this is the first time I've given this talk, so please welcome. I want to start with this image. This is one of the first images that came my way in my PhD. I actually had to send away to India to get it. This is a cartoon from the absolutely sort of foundational piece of work by Sunita Narain and Anil Agarwal for the Center of Science and Environment based in New Delhi. And they wrote this fairly small pamphlet called Global Warming and Unequal World, A Case of Environmental Colonialism. Now, back in my PhD, you could not get this online. I literally mailed money to New Delhi and hoped with my fingers crossed that something would come back in the mail, and sure enough, it did. And this diagram to me is as important now as it was then. You really can't talk about climate change without talking about a north-south division in terms of accumulation and exploitation. And these patterns are contested and they're deep. At the same time, we have this. Now, this is one of my favorite images. This also comes from the Durban climate negotiations. This is the huddle. So this is actually a day after the negotiations were supposed to have wrapped up. This is the first time the UN climate negotiations run overtime. They've run 24 hours overtime. People have literally not left this room in over a day. The leaders of the negotiations get really frustrated and they actually say, all right, fine, we cannot do this anymore. Go sort it out. And this is actually the huddle, which has now become a technique. They actually say, we'll tell people, go huddle, and this is what they do. Now, in this image, who do we have? So for those of you who haven't spent way too much time at UNFCCC negotiations, you may not know that the gentleman in the red tie is Todd Stern, the former chief envoy for climate change for the United States. The woman with the gray sweater is Subinius, who is the lead lawyer on climate change for the Americans. Seated at the table, we have the Europeans. The woman in the orange, their back to us, is she's actually based in the UK, but she's a representative for least developed countries. And the Black woman in the middle with the red check is the COP president at the time, who was the Minister of Environment for South Africa. Now, why this image is powerful, there's actually a lot of reasons this image is interesting. And we could go into representation and who's not in this image, for instance. But at this moment, Todd Stern says, apparently, according to all the witnesses in the room, if equity's in, we're out. Now, what they were negotiating was the foundational language for the Durban Accord, which then formed the basis for the Paris Agreement. It was at this moment, actually, that I realized I had been leaving the international climate scene, and I decided to return to the international climate scene. On one hand, we had this, where historical emissions were deeply uneven, and the Global South was clamoring for a new negotiation that would seriously take into consideration uneven historical patterns and that would bring justice. At the same time, you had this, countries simply refusing to even allow the word equity into what was going to become the framework which became the Paris Agreement. How do you reconcile a global situation on which one hand there cannot be any recognition of historical harms, and on the other hand, historical harms are central to the issue? This was the central debate at the international scene from about 2011 and 2005 with the Paris Agreement, where we could get into all the problems of this, which I think fundamentally failed to deal with this in any creative way, but that was probably an issue for questions. So one of the things that this led me to do was a major project where I worked with a large group of others, largely my collaborators in South Africa, where we looked at other systems which have tried to take both backwards and forwards approaches to any kind of a conflict. This situation where we have one group that doesn't want to acknowledge historical wrongs and another group which is saying historical wrongs are the biggest center of the problem is certainly not unique to climate. Anyone in the Canadian context right now could immediately say, oh yeah, this is exactly the issue in Canada. This is exactly the issue in any number of other countries where we have historically rooted problems. And yet we would like to move together forward somehow. So that led to this project where we were scoping out transitional justice as a potential approach in the climate space. My main collaborator here was a transitional justice practitioner from South Africa. And we were trying to imagine mechanisms by which you could help people navigate this elastic space between seriously recognizing the past and using that to build solidarity for the future. And we can get into that in more detail. But really what starts to emerge from this work, I think, is when you take seriously the past and the future, it opens up a huge space of other patterns. Once we started doing this, we had to understand why different countries were claiming things. We had to start thinking why countries were resisting this. And as I'm going to lead to in a minute, this opened up a whole bunch of other spaces. In a more small space, this also came up recently. I was working on a major project with an architect where we were trying to think how we might build climate justice into decision-making around the built environment. And it's a very simple thought, right? It's at any given moment, we are a moment in time. We have an existing situation of inequality, and every decision we can make can either feed into these dynamics which are ratcheting and making inequality even more stable and difficult, or in this moment, we can move towards decisions which are opening this space and might allow greater equality as we think about it. And so it's this, what I like about thinking about relationships is it puts you at a nexus of where we are with others as we move forward and as we think about the past. And so you're always kind of in this in-between space. Now, the other thing I mentioned, the second big point, was the benefit of thinking about relationships is that it really forces you to integrate the diversity of the issues that shape real life. This image is from Typhoon Haiyan. Now, Typhoon Haiyan hit at the middle of a climate negotiation. In 2013, I was in a climate negotiation and Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. At the time, it was the largest typhoon to hit the Philippines. Now, what was particularly shocking about this was that exactly a year earlier, also in the middle of the climate negotiations, one of the other largest typhoons ever to land in the Philippines had also landed in the middle of the climate negotiations. And Yeb Sano, who was the chief negotiator for the Philippines at the time, did what I think he felt he could do, which was to go on a hunger strike. And he went on a hunger strike for the rest of the climate negotiations as a form of solidarity with people back home. Now, what that act really drew attention to for me was both the depth of the existential crisis for some, and also the complexity of the issues. You couldn't fully think through why Typhoon Haiyan was such a devastating disaster until you understood why and how particular communities had been made vulnerable to it through a series of policies, many of which extend beyond the climate context. You started to open up questions in terms of why had this one had such a high loss of life, and Hurricane Katrina, which was relatively similar size and storm, had such a very different pattern. You can't even start to think through what climate impacts mean until you think through the relationships at the heart of any single given community. Why and how is any community impacted the way in which it is? And that's all about the relationships to others. Another way this was brought up is this. Now, for some of you, an AIDS ribbon may seem misplaced in a conversation about climate change. And that was exactly the puzzlement that was brought to me by a journalist. We were standing there and he was yelling at me because I was Canadian and Canadians were not being helpful. This was at the height of the Harper years, and Canadians did not have a very good reputation internationally. And so when traveling internationally to climate events as a Canadian, you tended to attract quite a bit of attention. And he came up to me and he was really, really angry. He had been asking some negotiators about World AIDS Day. He said, I don't understand. I asked them straight up, what about AIDS? It's World AIDS Day. How could they not understand me? And when he told me this, I completely understood what had happened. From a South African perspective, in 2011, AIDS was continuing to be a crisis. In the university dormitories where I was staying, there was not enough money to purchase toilet paper, but every single bathroom stall had a box of condoms in the back of it as an attempt to try to deal with the AIDS crisis. To have a situation where you're talking about climate and climate vulnerability, adaptation, and not take into account the implications of what the AIDS crisis had done to small communities in terms of who was there, who wasn't there, who was bearing which kinds of costs, who was taking care of grandkids, where were kids, who was being orphaned. You couldn't even think about how that then interacted with climate change without talking about AIDS. To a negotiator from England, who this journalist was talking to, the issue of AIDS had nothing to do with climate change. It was off the scope. It was being too vague. It was not relevant to the conversation. And again, this is where I think if you're really trying to understand why and how different communities are being impacted or what options they have, a real attention to relationships, who you are, who they are, how people are connected, allows you to think about what inclusivity really means. And so we also see this, in some work I was doing with a colleague of mine, Harold Winkler, who used to be at the Energy Research Center at the University of Cape Town. We were doing a critique of integrated assessment models, and we can all talk to Hattie about his backdrop here. And one of the critiques of these models was how they were or were not able to even consider equity. So things like if you have an economic model and it's looking at climate impacts, and by definition, it excludes all subsistence fisheries because subsistence fisheries don't bring in money and you can't model it. What you've effectively said is that those people do not exist. And once you've just said that a whole portion of the world's population doesn't exist, how on earth do you expect to use that model to then make just and inclusive climate policy recommendations if you have just declared that those human beings do not exist? And so this looks like a technical feature, but it actually is all about who is seen and how they're seen, and recognizing that other factors shape the tools that we use. And so this has spurred a whole bunch of thinking I've done about what inclusive policy analysis would look like in this space. I want to share this slide. I know we're moving along on time. I don't actually have a metric. My phone is not on, but I just going to keep moving here. This is a diagram of cumulative emissions.
24 minutes in, just so you know.
I can wrap it up. Perfect. This is a diagram of cumulative emissions. Now I'm bringing this up because one of the elements of my job that I take very seriously is public engagement. And so I happen to be in a church basement in Tempe, Arizona, where I spend a lot of time, not because I'm Christian, but because that's where people go. If you want to do public engagement, you go where people go. And if they go to church basements, you go to church basements. So I was in a church basement and I was presenting on climate change and justice. And I showed not this exact slide, but another one that had cumulative emissions. And as soon as I showed it, a number of people got up, literally, physically got up and walked out. And over the years, as I've given talks about justice and climate change, I've run into all kinds of interesting interactions on this issue. And these are all true, real things, quotes, right? My favorite is the email, Dr. Klinsky, we're good people, but we don't know what to do, right? Would you come talk to us? What are we supposed to do in this space? What does goodness mean here? People telling me, when you talk to other people, you shouldn't talk about equity, being literally yelled at by people in the audience. What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? You're coming here. What do you want me to do? People coming up and saying, oh, I know this is an issue for some people, but my family always recycles. Well, I have to fly. My job is important. All the kind of responses that people have given me over the years when talking about justice and climate change. Now, what's interesting is there's very little research about how do you deal with the psychological challenges of an injustice, especially when working with and trying to engage populations of privilege in the climate space. Now, it just so happens that there is no shortage of really interesting scholarship that looks at how you work with populations of privilege in other areas. Anti-racism education, decolonizing education, education around violence against women. All kinds of people have worked really hard to think about how do you work with those who are most privileged in systems where you don't either get them to deny, either run to innocence, my family always recycles, I'm one of the good ones, or deny, justify, or what do you want me to do about it? What do you want me to do about it? Anger response. And so this is an area where I think thinking about the relationships and the ways in which we relate to one another is actually incredibly powerful and not fully explored in the climate justice space. This is an action area where I'm currently, hopefully, I've got a couple of grant feelers out where I wanted to actually do some more experimental research in terms of how do we do this kind of public outreach? What we're actually asking a North American, largely white settler population to do is really difficult. For any of you who have been in conversations around privilege, navigating privilege, how do you work constructively in this space? It's not an easy thing to actually engage with the depth of injustice. And so this is an area where I think taking this social psychological barriers seriously is a very smart move. And finally, I want to bring the last one that I think is really important for us as scholars in this space. So this is my own fantastic artwork here. I think about solidarity as the central element of what I do. And are you putting your head in your hands, Hattie? I know I'm not a drawer, but you know. And I've often thought about the climate situation as a joint collective project. Here we have this little boat, it's stuck on the rocks. I'm interpreting because I realize my artwork may not speak for itself. And you're trying to figure out how you're going to get this thing moving. And it's got a lot of inertia, it's really stuck. And one of the questions that often comes up is I have students in my office and they're often in tears because they feel so strongly that they want to do something. And the question is always, you know, what's the thing I should do? Where is the leverage point? What is the most important thing? And I always say, you know, let's take a step back. Who are you? What do you bring to this case? This is all about solidarity. This is all about figuring out what little piece you have in this larger puzzle and how your actions are going to change, amplify, interact with the actions of somebody else. And so here we have people pushing, we have people blowing wind, we have people trying to splash water. You got to figure out which of these actions you are. You can only be one of them. You're one person. So this came up. It's not always easy though, right? So one of the lessons I had from doing this was when I was working for World Resources Institute. I had been commissioned to, it's a crazy project if I say so myself. I had been commissioned to write a narrative for equity that would work domestically for all countries and also work internationally for the climate negotiations. And I had 3 months to do it. And we had an international advisory board. And one of the interesting things about this is that I had thought that because domestic inequality was such a limiting force for actually many countries in terms of what they could do for climate action, that this might be a really important part to include in this international conversation about injustice and equity. And when I presented this, a number of the members of the Global South were absolutely furious. One threatened to withdraw from the study or from the project. And I'm still dealing with the ramifications of this project because people felt that as someone in the Global North, I was absolutely inappropriate for me to be working in the climate space and drawing attention to inequality within developing countries, particularly in a context of UNFCCC, where many countries have a seat only after very protracted colonial disputes of trying to get independence. And that any effort by someone in the Global North to draw attention to domestic tensions was actually undermining solidarity. And so what was very interesting here was this huge lesson for me in terms of trying to think about all of those people, by the way, agreed that domestic inequality was a problem. The problem was where and how I was acting in this particular space. I've collaborated with many of those people since, and we all can work together. So it's not individuals, it's the power that you are taking in any given particular project. And so in this situation, you had to think about, well, who am I related to in relation to others? And who am I positioned to work with, and how am I going to do so? Another key example of this, and this is one of those classic diagrams where they always tell you not to show a diagram that you're not going to explain in depth. And I'm going to anyway, because the point that I'm trying to bring here is that these things are a big mess. They're all interconnected. This came out of our transitional justice project. And I think it's actually one of the most important insights that came out of that project. I absolutely don't think you should read it all. The point here is that all of the arrows are interconnected. And each one of these elements would require huge efforts from a community to actually push it forward. But where it gets exciting is the interrelationships between these things. If you had a process of acknowledgement that you could tie to increase legal liability for corporations so they had more pressure on them, you might get somewhere. If you could both advance in terms of a reparations commission and have stronger legal rules for corporations, you could get somewhere. If you could, right? So this is the thing where it's thinking about the and plus. Who am I? What am I doing? And how, if I was successful here, could it create opportunities for that person over there to change, amplify, deepen what they're doing? And so from this, I kind of developed a set of core project questions that I always ask now when I'm starting to work on a new project. And right now I'm working on a bunch of them that all involve capacity building. I see my time and I'm just one slide left. And these are the kinds of questions that are focused, right? Of who am I? Who am I working with? Why? How can I be useful? What am I trying to achieve? Basically, these are all about positionality. And that, of course, takes us right back to the very beginning, where we were thinking about my land acknowledgement and who am I in this space? And where have I gotten here? And by which history am I seeing things? What am I not seeing? Are there other ways that I could engage with knowledge here that would change how I'm thinking? So with that, I want to thank everyone, including actually quite a number of people in this virtual room who have been pretty crucial to my thinking, and open it up to questions. And I will stop sharing so that I can see you all and we can have a better conversation.
If you guys put your hands up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say thank you before we jumped into questions, Sonja. It's just great to see you and great to hear you think out loud again. Always a pleasure. And Hadi, I think you were gonna start with questions, students first.
Yes, hands up.
Yeah. And Sonja, you probably picked up on this, but there's always this kind of sustained pause right before people start to, it's a Zoom effect, it seems, jump in with questions.
If you want.
Okay.
We'll see a hand up.
They're not student ones, but just give people a second here.
One thing qualitative research makes you very good at is waiting the other person out and creating all kinds of space for people to volunteer information.
Yeah, and the variation across communities of what is a comfortable space is fascinating in its own right.
Okay, Zara, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question, please? Zara, were you able to hear me? Please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Heidi, and thanks for a very nice presentation. It was a very interesting topic to me, and the thing that I wanted to know, as I understood from your presentation, Sonja, that climate change, it looks a very wide topic to me. So first of all, I wanted to know that if from climate change, if you consider any, if you address any specific issue on climate change, or and then also if you had a chance to talk to any politicians in regards that issue, and if so, if you notice that if your conversation with that politicians had any particular impact on them, or if you could experience any specific impact on the result of your conversation with the politicians.
So yeah, I've spoken with lots of politicians of various kinds over my work, sometimes in a very collaborative space and sometimes in a less collaborative space. I am the kind of scholar who I work on climate as I purposefully like it because it's so broad. So I'm the kind of person who likes to take ideas from many different places and see if I can push them together rather than go really, 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 really deep into one area. And that's just how I roll. In terms of, in terms of have I made a politician, for instance, change their mind about something? Probably not. Because I'm fairly broad, I've worked with different politicians at different sub-specific issues, right? So for instance, when I was working on the Built Environment Project, we reached out to lots of people who were in zoning commissions or who were involved in those decisions, and we shared our results and we thought through how we were doing it with them. I have no idea if it had any impact or not. Similarly, when I was doing the Transitional Justice Project, we purposefully brought in a whole variety of negotiators, representatives from different places. There was, everything from very local people to people who were representing countries at the international level as collaborators in that project. It's a different way of going to with someone with a finding, and it's about bringing people in from the beginning to see how that would shape our ideas. So I have done that. I think it depends on what your specific issue. For me, in all of those situations, I've been trying to get people to open or reframe the way they're talking about the problem, which is a very kind of upstream type of engagement. It's different than saying, I have this particular analysis about this particular transportation plan and I want you to listen. It's a very different kind of interaction. So that may not entirely satisfy you, but that's just to give you a sense of how I have approached those people in power, has been depending on which particular lens of the problem I'm working on at any given time. And there's been many different lenses over time. But I first started doing that at my PhD, actually. I went to talk to a bunch of politicians, which was quite entertaining, if I do say so myself.
Thank you, Tanya.
Hands or questions in the chat?
Do you see Rocio's hand?
Rocio, yes, please. Unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Hi, thank you, Sonja, for that great talk. I was wondering, how would you reconcile the fact that we need more people at international negotiations from the Global South to foster equity and justice, but at the same time, there are systemic issues of lack of capacities or not adequate education at the Global South? I don't know, how could you reconcile that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. One of my colleagues and I are actually working on a little collaborative project around the issue of capacity and what that looks like. You know, there are a number of this is a complicated question, because one element of this is you would like people to be able to fully represent their own best interests at the UN level. And that requires a whole bunch of skills and forms of assessment and training, which they may or may not have. And there's a lot of really interesting efforts. So for instance, I was just in a meeting this morning with some folks who do legal training for developing country negotiators. Now, I'm using the word developing country here on purpose. This is because within the UNFCCC, developing countries are a recognized political organizing entity, and they use that language on purpose for very particular political reasons. And so in this particular case, using that language is actually reinforcing the arguments that they're making, and I wouldn't probably use that in other contexts. But that there's a reason why that language is being used in this space. So for instance, doing legal training, there's other examples where people are trying to work to amplify those voices in a variety of ways, whether it be behind the scenes in terms of helping people publish, finding ways of sharing basic resources, everything from papers to, honestly, it gets down to the real, it's amazing. You start to really understand the depth of the inequalities here in terms of access to international publications because of fees. You start to think through in terms of access to international conferences. You start to think through in terms of who gets access to journals and what happens to those publications when they are submitted to journals. So I sit on a board of an editorial board of a journal, and one of my main contributions there is to often work with authors from the Global South who are having to find ways of getting their language shaped that it can be seen as knowledge. Now, should I have to do that? No, knowledge should be seen as knowledge. However, the ramifications of just how uneven this situation is means you have to use whatever pieces of leverage you have at any given time to contribute to this. And sometimes it's a big thing, like thinking about funding and thinking about how to share funding, building in money for making sure that anyone you're working with in the Global South is getting paid for that work, which often we assume that people are going to collaborate for free, which is absolutely not a legitimate assumption. So it depends on what level you're talking about. If you were talking about what can you as an academic do, these are some of the small things you can do. If you're talking about how to change the whole system, I mean, the UN does have some systems, but it's flawed on so many levels that it really, you can tackle it at that level. But for me personally, I've ended up doing these other mechanisms because to truly tackle that at that global level is pretty daunting, to be honest. So I think you try to shape your engagement all the time, thinking through how would this collaboration lead to an increased capacity, and in what and how.
Sophia, would you like to ask the next question, please?
Thanks, Hadi, and thank you so much, Sonja, for the talk. That was great. I just had a couple of things, not really exactly a question, but just as someone who's thought about this a lot for a long time, and I'm working in international trade, but there are many similarities in terms of capacity to participate multilaterally. But one thing was any reflections on the question of time and the historic injustice and the current pressures and the sort of link to that, the real disaggregation of the Global South into many different kinds of countries with many different constraints. You know, the the possibilities for India, say with the space program, compared to the possibilities for Eritrea or Samoa, and how just thoughts on that. Like, I think there's lots of ways to think about it and deal with it, but it does complicate, I think, some of the, especially the bringing on board of a negotiator who's never thought of this outside the Canadian context until they just got this shiny new job and they're off to the UN to talk about it. But those two issues for me, the way the history versus the current, and the fact that there isn't really a global South, or that idea, I think is beginning to become anachronistic almost. Yeah, I feel like over my lifetime, it's become more difficult to capture things with that term.
Yeah, I think it's this issue of how we think and categorize countries, think about and categorize countries is a really interesting one, and the politics of it are fraught. So, you know, I was just on a call this morning with a representative of PACJA who's in Kenya, and on one hand, you can say, wow, the differences amongst countries are so big now that there's no point in lumping them together in this North-South division. The Paris Agreement, for instance, purposefully has this self-differentiated approach, which is this idea there's a spectrum and everything's on a spectrum. On the other side of that, like anything else, telling people that, you know, oh, well, there's differences amongst all of us can obfuscate very sharp commonalities across countries and histories, and it can allow a kind of whitewashing effectively of innocence across accountability. And so saying, and this was at the heart of the debates around the Paris Agreement. So if you look at the statements from Obama, if you look at the statements from Christiana Figueres, who was the secretary at the time, it was all about collective, you know, we did it, we can do it, we did it, we did. We can do it, we did it, was Christiana Figueres' tweet. Obama is talking about, this is about collective responsibility for the global future of humanity. And I think we have to be very skeptical and very critical as we look at what discourse is, a discourse of, this is about global humanity, and say, well, wait a minute, actually there are some big differences here. And some of those fall in a North-South division. And if you go to the point where you're saying, well, every country's different, so we all have to have different agreements, that actually plays to the hands of the big actors like the United States, who would like the entire global South not to be negotiating as a bloc. That's a purposeful political stance. And countries like the United States would far rather be in bilateral negotiations where they have much more power than in a multilateral space where you have all of these actors. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful not to fall into a discourse where these languages become sort of common sense, and yet actually there still is a lot of commonality in a large amount of the global South when we're talking about the injustices of climate change. There still is a lot of similarity there. Now, it does get even more complicated when you start talking about historical responsibility. And so, for instance, China's contributions have historically been, if you look at a historical accumulation part until recently, yes, sure, they have high annual emissions, but compared to an accumulation and their population, it was not really that big a deal. That's starting to shift when you're looking at cumulative emissions now, where you start starting to have to talk about, if you're going to talk about historical responsibility, you are going to have to start talking about some of these larger players. And it does make it much more fraught to figure out that space. So I think on one hand, I completely agree with you that a clear North-South division doesn't capture the diversity of the world. On the other hand, I would point out that there is power in the narrative that says, oh, it doesn't matter anymore, because I think it does matter a lot. And you know, I see it, even the most equity-minded negotiator from the global North doesn't want to talk about colonialism, doesn't want to talk about any form of capital accumulation. And I think these are important conversations to have if we're actually going to talk about climate change and justice. And they get erased by this, oh, it just doesn't matter anymore narrative. And so I both see the complexity of the question, but I'm also, that's kind of how I'm not quite comfortable going either way on that one.
Kai?
Thanks, Adi, and thanks, Sonja. It was great to see your presentation and to hear your voice again. It's been too long, for sure. I have a reflection that I think you might have a reaction to, and then I also have a question, and I'll bundle them together. It's interesting how different it is in a biodiversity space, and I wonder whether you have any ideas about why. In the international context, there for sure is a certain reluctance to talk about inequity. You know, they'd much prefer to talk about inequalities in terms of biodiversity conversations with the CBD and IPBES. But in terms of the international aspects, there's a very well-trodden path of the richer nations paying for certain capacities among the lower and middle income nations. And there's a lot about that conversation that's just not even up for debate or question anymore. And I think that there are, you know, several differences there, but I just want to point to the fact that, you know, some of these conversations about equity, once they're won, they're kind of won for good. And some of them don't get brought up again. And so, you know, just maybe a note of encouragement that, you know, just keep going with it, because at some point, you know, you'll get there, and then it won't be a constant backsliding, I think. The second is about, I've faced the same kind of questioning from people about, like, what am I supposed to do? And I think that that is a really common angry response in the face of pointing to privilege. And I think that a part of the problem is that it's just so unsettling, right? The notion that you're privileged conveys kind of inherently in so many of us this notion that therefore we have a responsibility. And it's like, well, what are you asking? And so I've just got used to filling that, like, before the question comes up, by letting people know basically what I'm calling for. And I'm just interested to hear, because I didn't get a sense of it from your talk, as to how you answer that question for folks. Like, what do you want them to do?
Yeah, so I can take both of those. The first one, so I haven't done a lot of work on the biodiversity space. I think they're actually the two elements I think are really connected. The thing that I think really sets the climate space, I don't know if it's apart, so that's not a fair comment because I don't work a lot in the biodiversity space, but I think one of the key elements of what makes the equity situation so tricky in the climate space is that it hits very, very, very close to the fundamental drivers of capital accumulation. And it hits very, very close to how we all use energy every day and the very elements in which this is built into our lives. We are all talking on computer screens, for instance. And the depth of the change that would be required to seriously tackle emissions are pretty profound. They are tied directly to entire development pathways for countries. They are tied directly to both the maintenance of the status quo. They're tied directly to the accumulation of things we use and take for granted every single day. From functioning medical systems to energy systems that work. I was in a call this morning that we had to reschedule 3 times because my colleague in Kenya could not get electricity this morning. And that's just the lived reality. And when you're talking about climate change, that's what you're talking about. It's across the whole basis, and we're talking about a finite amount of atmospheric space. So to some extent, you can try to frame this, and it has been tried to frame through green growth as win-win, or as all kinds of things that aren't going to require some degree of zero-sum negotiation. But at the end of the day, it's one shared atmospheric space that has a finite capacity to absorb emissions. Emissions are profoundly uneven, and they are linked to things that people could not even imagine their lives without. For many of you on this call, I expect one of the weirdest things about this year is that you haven't been on an airplane. Think about how immersed that was into your very fundamental way of being. That's like a privilege that almost nobody has globally. And when you're talking about emissions, they're built into all these things. And so I think it is a little different just because it's so tied to almost everything about how we think an economy and a society will work.
Yeah, I mean, just super quickly in response to that, I would say that all of that's true with biodiversity. Biodiversity is threatened by climate change, and so it's, you know, it's equally, all of those challenges are equally true. I think maybe the difference is that it's just not as obvious to folks, you know, that people see
Yeah.
biodiversity as being about wildlife and, you know, about like fish and game regulations, and not about all of these massive global issues. But anyway,
Yeah, no, but the climate negotiations are not also about money. They're about people willing to change their economies, which you could say is also needed in the biodiversity, but it's front and center. That is the core of the Paris Agreement. Who is going to change in which ways? And that makes it really conflictual. And there may be ways around that, but that to date has been the heart of the conflict, is that. The other element in terms of the privilege one, this is actually why I'm in the middle of applying for a grant that will focus exactly on pedagogical strategies, because the ways I'm doing it are, when I talk to other people who are also doing this, we're doing it from our gut instincts about how to deal with this, and we actually don't know. You can try to engage in all kinds of ways. You can try to, so if you look at the literature on pedagogies of the privileged, I've tried this in various ways. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can try to understand people's own sense of vulnerability or where they're coming from, what they're most worried about, as a way of being heard, as to try to kind of get that out of the way at the beginning, and then you can find ways of circling back, and that sometimes works. You can find ways of trying to articulate exactly what you're asking so people can make it much more concrete and realize that maybe it's not so crazy. You can try to reframe it in terms of all the other kinds of things they can do. So what I typically do is I have a 4-part model where I go through sort of daily life decisions, big life decisions, like how many kids you're going to have, where's your house going to be, how are you going to think about big life decisions. Think about your role as a member of society, so everything from your church group to your role as a teacher to whatever to the political space. And then we work through all the different kind of option sets people have in these different spheres of their life. And for some people, they're more willing to work in one, and for some people, they're more willing to work in another. And you can start thinking about how they could imagine their lives as much more multifaceted. And in this, I'm trying to get away from an idea that either we're only consumers and we only work with our dollars, or we're only citizens and we only work with our votes. And that in fact, there's actually lots of ways that we can engage. And so that's how I've typically done it, by trying to help people map what is it they're most scared of losing when I get that angry in the face response. And sometimes that works, and sometimes I just get yelled at, and that's fine. I mean, whatever, I just keep moving.
Okay, I'm inviting Simon to ask the last question. Simon.
Thanks, Hadi. And Sonja, thanks for the terrific presentation, and that answer you just gave as well. I think that's such a great approach to sort of showing the portfolio of the ways one can respond. I'll ask something really quick because I know we're near the end. One of the things I sort of took away from your talk, and I want to get a sense of whether this is accurate, is what you're saying, that, you know, there's this big area of literature and research now, and I'm not sure if Jiaying's on the call, but like of people doing climate change communication research, like cultural cognition, that type of work. And it almost sounds to me like you're asking to marry that with climate justice research, and that overlap isn't happening enough. Is that fair to say?
I think there's a huge opportunity there for sure. There is a huge overlap conceptually. And there's actually several. So there's the climate change communication stuff. There in the social psychology of climate, which has grown a lot since I first started studying. And then the climate justice community. And where the climate justice community, I think where you could even do more is, for instance, taking advantage of the pedagogy part. So a lot of the climate communication stuff is coming from science communication. It's not always coming from sort of social justice pedagogies, which are engaging exactly with how do you change systems of deep injustice. A lot of it's coming from a different spot. The climate justice community is trying to bring that in. So if you actually talk to climate justice activists, a lot of those people who are kind of the front lines of the activist communities are working across anti-racism activism, and they're in practice using a lot of these techniques, but the literature, I think, is behind the times. And I don't think it's taken advantage of the fact there is all this research and experimentation going on, both in practice and intellectually, that you don't see very much in the climate space. And it deals with these issues of discomfort. How do you deal with people's discomfort? How do you deal with people's anger towards you? It's on the fringes. I think there's a huge scope for so much more really interesting work that could leverage those different lines together.
Thanks, I agree. So that's great.
So I hadn't forgotten how lovely it is to have you as a colleague and collaborator and listen to you think out loud. And I wish we could do this on a more regular basis. So I hope something happens and that we get the opportunity to do that. In the interim, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking you for just a marvelous presentation and opening our eyes to the challenges that you've been trying to address since your thesis. Take care.
Thanks. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always emailable.
Thanks so much, Sonja. That was terrific. Really
Thanks.
great to see you. To be continued.
Yeah, anytime.
Okay,
Thank you, Sonja.
bye
Yeah.
now.
Bye, everyone.
Are you staying on?
We could just organize another talk, Addie. Unfortunately, I have to deal with a student.
I want your, can I have a look at that diagram that you showed? Because I think I have a suggestion.
The boat?
No, the boat was lovely. I like
The
it.
arrows connecting to all other arrows.
Yeah, I want to see that because I think I'd love to understand it.
Okay,
Or the
one
paper that it came with.
right now, I have a few minutes. I can do it.
No,
for you.
afterwards. You can send it to me. afterwards.
I'm gonna send it. I'll just send it to you. You can give me all kinds
You
of color.
can muse on it.
Yeah, okay.
Sounds good.
Okay,
Lovely
bye
to see you.
Sonja. Talk
Bye-bye.
soon.
Thanks so much. Bye.